welcome everyone to one of the first two webinars that the NIAID is hosting, focused on the NIAID Clinical Trials Unit Recompetition. This is Manizhe Payton from the Division of AIDS, and I'm joined here by Bola Adedeji, as well as some of our grants management program colleagues for this conversation today. And we welcome everyone to this discussion. We'll have, I think, about 100 folks on this webinar today. So in order to have the call run efficiently, I'm going to ask folks to write the questions in the chat box. We will not be enabling the audio function, but I will be stopping at least 4 time points throughout the presentation, and we'll take questions at those times, and we'll go in the order the questions were asked. So feel free to jot down questions in the chat box as we go through the conversation, or when I stop to ask for questions. Okay, so today what we're doing is we're extending the conversation that Carl Diefenbach began in June of this year around the NIAID's HIV research scientific areas of emphasis to the clinical trials units and clinical research sites. And what we'll do is I'll start with an overview of where we are in the timeline of the CTU Recompetition. Then I'll focus on the Institute's enduring commitments to the CTUs, then transition to opportunities for refinement of the CTU model, and then introduce some areas for discussion and feedback. And then lastly, we'll pivot to a discussion of our approach to improving the protocol funding process, and I'll turn the discussion over to Bola at that time. And as we transition to the protocol funding process, we'll sort of reorient you on some activities that we intend to implement during this cycle of this CTU grant cycle. Okay, so by way of background, the NIAID HIV/AIDS Network Enterprise is recompeted every 7 years, and while the scientific priorities of the network enterprise continue to evolve to reflect scientific advancements and forward-looking scientific priorities, we believe that the CTUs are critical components of this network enterprise, and they're positioned to contribute to these evolving scientific priorities. Carl has outlined the areas of research emphasis around non-vaccine prevention, HIV vaccines, and therapeutics. And those slides and the webinars from his presentations are listed here, and they're available here at the link of the second bullet. The CTUs have made tremendous contributions to our network enterprise, from generation of protocol concepts through protocol implementation and publications. And importantly, we're positioning this recompetition as a refinement of the CTU model rather than a restructuring. And we're seeking to refine the model to optimize the contributions of the CTUs. And your feedback is going to be important as we move forward. So this is where we are now. We have the next 6 months to gather feedback from our stakeholder community. We're planning to go to NIAID Council for approval of the CTU concept, as well as the networks, in late January of 2018. So at the end of January of next year, we'll be presenting this initiative to NIAID Council. Then after we receive Council approval, we will start writing the CTU funding opportunity announcement. So now is the time for us to solicit input from our stakeholders, and we're starting with a series of public webinars and are planning additional outreach activities that I will speak to shortly over the next 6 months to gather feedback. We're planning to publish the CTU FOA in the second quarter of 2019, with applications due a few months after the FOA is published. Importantly, we're committed to ensuring that the scientific priorities are published in advance of the CTU FOA so the CTU applicants have ample opportunity to review and address these scientific priorities. So we're thinking that these would be made, the HIV/AIDS scientific priorities would be made available publicly, maybe through the NIAID website, and the CTUs will have ample time to be able to review those to assist them with developing their application to this funding opportunity announcement. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions around the timeline and the activities planned leading up to the next series of awards that will be made in December of 2020.
Just a reminder to submit your questions through the question and chat box.
Okay. Okay. Certainly just continue to write questions if you've got questions. So I'm going to talk now about the 3 enduring commitments from the Institute that we're carrying forward to this next competitive cycle of CTUs. First, we're committed to the CTU model. We believe this model works well to encourage scientific contribution and sustain performance at the clinical research site level. Just as a reminder, this picture shows us the CTUs is comprised of performance sites on the left, which provide scientific contribution and are the protocol implementing arms of the networks they're affiliated with. The CTU also provides oversight and training and support to its component sites and brings to bear central resources if they have regulatory support, training support, and in some cases centralized laboratory and pharmacy support to facilitate protocol conduct. We're committed to allowing flexibility to bring on protocol-specific sites, and we will continue that model as necessary to meet the needs of a protocol, and to defund non-performing sites in a CTU. And that is something that has happened in this cycle, and I think that's an important component of the flexibility that we need to have in the CTU model to meet the evolving scientific needs of the networks. Our goal is to strengthen this model moving forward. So that is an enduring commitment from the Institute. Secondly, we are committed to maintaining core funding for the CTUs. The core funding is going to continue to be provided on an annual basis to be able to support baseline activities of the unit. And that amount of funding will continue to vary based on the size and scope of CTU. And essentially that means the number of component sites and the number of network affiliations for the CTU. So we're committed to that, and we're going to continue that funding model. Bola will talk a little bit, we'll talk about the protocol funding model and the layering on of protocol funds and some approaches to streamline that model a little bit later in the presentation. But from a core funding perspective, we will continue to provide core funding over the 7-year duration of this award. Thirdly, we intend to fund an appropriate number of CTUs to meet the scientific priorities of the HIV/AIDS networks. We will not be increasing the number of CTUs that we fund. We currently fund 37 CTUs. I expect we will fund between 30 and 35 CTUs in this next cycle. And importantly, regardless of whether you're CTU now, everyone will be competing for these awards, and it will be a fair and open competition that is open to all comers. Our message to the CTUs is to stay consolidated. That was a big area of emphasis in our last cycle, and we believe that the consolidations have overwhelmingly been positive in achieving the goals and trying to maximize efficiencies and reduce some of the administrative burdens from our grants perspective. And we will be seeking sites with demonstrated experience enrolling participants in IND-level randomized clinical trials, and performance will be a big factor in the review of these applications. The performance does not need to be linked to HIV/AIDS network activities, but we are looking for sites that have experience enrolling in IND-level clinical trials to compete for these awards. This is not the mechanism where we are going to be building clinics into research sites. There are other funding opportunities and other training mechanisms that could be sought to be able to support and developing a site and some of the early stages of site development, but this is not that opportunity. We are looking for high-level, high-functioning, high-performing sites in this competition. Okay. I'm going to now pivot and talk a little bit about some of the refinements that we are planning for the CTUs in the next cycle, the 2020 to 2027 cycle. We recognize that the funding model has been burdensome, and our goal is to streamline the administrative activities related to the funding model to be able to allow the funds to be provided to the sites and get the money where it needs to be, where the research is being conducted in a streamlined manner. So Bola will talk a little bit about our approaches to that, but we are committed to some harmonization activities and some other activities directed from the NIAID to guide streamlining of our protocol funding model. We also want to build in some flexibility for the CTUs to work across a broader portfolio of NIAID infectious disease research. I don't think we've done this well. This was an aspirational goal as well in our last competitive cycle. And for those of you that recall, we had an optional component 11 where CTU applicants could speak to their scientific interest and capacity in working in antimicrobial research. And I don't think that that's been optimized at this point, but we do believe that there are opportunities for the CTUs to participate in some evolving infectious disease priorities. And we've had some examples in this cycle where some of our HIV/AIDS network CTUs have participated in Zika activities and some other infectious disease activities. And we want to strengthen that in this cycle. The idea here is that this will be an optional activity that will be based on the interest of a site, their access to the relevant population, and the infrastructure that they bring to bear based on these other non-HIV/AIDS infectious disease priorities. We're considering whether this is something that needs to be written into the funding opportunity announcement, or there will be a section for sites to write to this. We certainly are going to build some flexibility within our terms of award for the CTU to allow non-HIV work across these CTUs. And we are committed to working with our colleagues at DMED to develop processes to evaluate sites, especially looking at these CTUs to evaluate their potential to contribute to some other priorities. So I think the dialogue around this issue has been there's been some interest in contributing. We've heard that there's interest in contributing scientifically to some of these other infectious disease priority areas in terms of protocol concept development and other scientific contributions. That's not what that's not what I'm talking about in this bullet. We're talking about the ability for our sites to be able to participate in terms of enrollment and accrual into these non-HIV trials. So there are other mechanisms to be able to engage scientifically in non-HIV areas like CFARs and other mechanisms, but that's not what the goal is here. And this, again, is going to be an optional issue, and we're happy to dialogue around this a little bit more as our ideas around this solidify. Third, in terms of refinement, one thing we're considering has to do with the responsibilities of the CTUs to be able to support their protocol-specific sites. And we've leaned more heavily on protocol-specific sites in this competitive cycle. We've had needs to expand beyond the funded portfolio of HIV/AIDS network sites to identify other sites to meet specifically some of the prevention priorities. And it's been a good exercise for us, and we believe the CTUs bring value to these protocol-specific sites. And we think that one issue we're considering is a model where we provide some limited core funding support to CTUs for the activities that they provide to support their protocol-specific sites. And we're doing some internal modeling now to take a look at what that funding amount may be. But it's been an area that we'd like to strengthen, and there's been variable amount of funding support provided to the CTUs for their protocol-specific sites, and we would like to harmonize this and consider providing that funding directly from the NIAID to these CTUs for their PS sites. And then fourthly, in terms of refinement, we've really been challenged in some areas of the world this cycle with the layering on of clinical trials, especially in the prevention arena, that has pushed some of our sites to their capacity. and their systems have been pushed to the capacity. Their systems, their human resources have all been really challenged. And we think that capacity evaluation is an important component of the CTU's abilities to perform at a high level. So one thing we're thinking about building in, and we're not quite sure how we're going to do this yet, so your feedback would be important, is some ongoing capacity evaluation of these units, so that we can have some data around the population that they can access, and any barriers that they may have in place that we want to work with them to overcome. And I think that there's a way that we can work in a systematic way to strengthen capacity and build capacity to be able to plan properly for these upcoming trials and their ongoing workload. But it's going to take a little more work. So we really think capacity evaluation is important, and we're trying to figure out how to structure that concept. Okay. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to pivot now and bring up a couple issues that we are going to be seeking some input for, and I would welcome any comments and any feedback. And then I'll talk a little bit about our outreach strategy. So we think it's important for CTUs to speak to their strengths. We are looking for CTUs that bring to bear to these applications relationships that leverage natural alignments that are in place. We've had experiences where CTUs have embarked on relationships that did not, that were relatively artificial relationships that didn't result in the synergies that we expect in a cohesive, productive CTU. So we're asking people to speak to their strengths as they consider alignments and relationships to be able to put forth the optimal CTU that has synergistic strengths across all of its components. And so collaboration is an important, component of this application. In terms of scope, we're still in the stages of determining, what it will take to be a responsive CTU in terms of the scope of network affiliations. And we can discuss that at two levels. One level is at the CTU level, and one level is at the CRS level. Recall last time, in order for a CTU to be responsive, it had to affiliate with at least 2 HIV/AIDS networks across all of the sites that comprise the application. And we're discussing that internally now. I think this is going to, what number we land on in terms of number of networks to affiliate with to be responsive will very much depend on how the scientific areas are aligned into networks. And so Carl has talked about the scientific areas. Right now we're thinking that it could be 2 networks. We're dialoguing around whether it would be 1 network to be responsive as a CTU applicant, as we think about treatment units or prevention units working across the age span. What we don't want to do is put in a requirement that's going to promote artificial alignments. We really want CTUs to speak to their strengths and leverage relationships, natural relationships that exist, rather than enter into artificial alignments just to be responsive to what the Institute is requiring for these applications. At the site level, one issue we've been talking about has to do with the scope of work at the site level across the network that they plan to affiliate with. We know that there are sites, as Carl's talked about the scientific areas, and we've talked about working in non-HIV vaccine work, and therapeutic work across the age span. We know that there will be sites that bring specialty areas of expertise to bear. And we do have a need for high-functioning, high-performing sites with specific capabilities, such as PK/PD capabilities or TB patients. And we embrace those sites. So we don't expect that all sites are going to be able to contribute across all of the scientific areas of emphasis of a network. And we want to make that clear that We think the more the better generally, but that there are going to be sites that are these specialty sites, and we will embrace those sites, and those will be critical for us to be able to meet the scientific agendas of the networks. So we would welcome any input on that issue as well in terms of CRS level participation across the network. Okay, I'm now going to pivot and talk a little bit about our outreach strategy and what we're planning over the next 6 months leading up to ARAC. We believe that feedback from our stakeholder community is absolutely critical. So we're taking a four-pronged approach to how we collect that feedback. We're starting with a series of webinars where we're putting out there some of these key areas of refinement and stimulating conversation around the units. We held a webinar on Monday. We're doing the same today. And we expect to have one more webinar prior to council where we present some of our final thoughts, sort of an opportunity for final thoughts and final feedback before we take this concept to council, probably in like late November, early December of this year. We've also scheduled a series of focus group meetings in geographic areas where we have a concentration of NIAID funding. And I'll talk a little bit about those areas where we'll be over the next few months in the next slide. We also welcome ad hoc consults with folks. We welcome telephone conversations. We would be happy to host folks at the NIAID to have discussions about the CTU initiative or at upcoming network or scientific meetings. We're also going to make ourselves available. And finally, the NIAID website will be a place where information is housed central to the network recompetition, as well as the CTU recompetition. So these slides will be posted, this webinar will be posted. We will be collecting questions and we'll be posting responses to questions on this website as well. So this is also an area for information and dialogue. So these are the areas where we will be hosting focus group sessions. We'll be on the west coast of the United States next week in San Francisco and LA. The following week we'll be on the East Coast in New York and Boston. We'll be in South Africa in September, mid-September in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And we're considering whether we'll have another focus group in October in Sub-Saharan Africa as well. So we welcome folks. Invites have gone out for these focus group sessions, and we've tried to invite all CTU PIs, CRS leaders that are in the relative geographic area close to these focus groups. And if you want any more information about these, please email myself or Bola, and we're happy to send you information about these. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. Anybody have any questions? Do you have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat box.
No questions so far.
Anything? Okay, haven't seen anything. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Bola now, and she's going to walk us through our approaches to optimizing the protocol funding model.
Thank you, Manizhe. So now let's turn our attention to the protocol funding. So you'll notice that we have titled this portion of our presentation today as Optimizing Business Processes for Success. By this, we're talking about the activities that we can perform immediately during the CTU grant cycle that will help us to be more efficient with our protocol funding, or PF, and carry us into the next cycle. So over the past 4 years of this competitive grant cycle, we have heard from you all, from our community of stakeholders. We've heard from the networks, we've heard from CTUs, we've heard from CRSs, and also based on our own internal activities all around the subject of protocol funds. We know that this area of protocol funds is one that could certainly use a lot more strengthening and where some changes need to be made. So in response to the protocol funding concerns and feedback from the past 4 years, NIAID has come up with 5 primary goals that we would like to accomplish. The first one is to improve NIAID oversight of PF support. The sheer amount of dollars that goes into the entire network enterprise is more than the entire budget allocation of some of our NIH institutes. And as such, we need to have very good processes in place to assure that we have the relevant NIAID oversight of these activities. The second goal that we put forward is to enhance planning. And this applies to all of our stakeholders. So that's planning for us here at the NIAID, planning at the network level, and planning even for the CTUs and their component CRSs. The third goal is to increase consistency. And this particularly is important for those CTUs that work across multiple networks. The importance of increasing consistency will hopefully make activities or operations at those CTUs and even the CTUs that work across fewer networks much better. The fourth goal is to reduce burden. And this is one area that we've heard a lot of feedback about. The administrative burden that has been imposed on the current PF, by the current PF model is just unacceptable. We have heard about the large number and complexity of subcontracts and invoices that some units have to execute in support of this enterprise. And this is something that we would like to make some changes to or try to address going forward. And the fifth goal is to reduce siloing. Even though we have 5 existing networks, we haven't empowered the CTU PIs to be able to make some decisions that they make in terms of efficiency because of the siloing consequence based on the way that we currently provide PF. And so this is another area that we hope we'll be able to address. So we have heard about all these issues and want to try to address them during this cycle before the next competition. You will notice that these 5 goals were the same goals that we laid out when we introduced the PF Pilot 1 earlier this year. Recall that PF Pilot 1 was designed to have NIAID distribute PF funds for ongoing participants directly to the CTUs. As you all know by now, this PF Pilot 1 has been put on hold. And it was put on hold because of the feedback we received from you when we introduced it a few months ago. What we heard was that although the pilot might help to address some of the goals that I just outlined, it will likely introduce other issues that may be more burdensome, and that is definitely not what we want to happen. So we have put this pilot 1 on hold until we can regroup and work on some improved strategies to accomplish our goals. So currently, each network has a different process for invoicing and payment of protocols. And often, there are even differences within a single network. So our goal is to come up with a set of standards that could be used across all networks for invoicing and contracting. What are the elements of these processes that could be harmonized, simplified, or even eliminated to achieve efficiencies? We're seeking efficiencies and more transparency in the processes to create a better understanding and to create less burden, particularly for CTUs and CRSs that work across multiple networks. We know that we have encouraged each of you CTUs and CRSs to consolidate and work across multiple networks. However, we haven't provided the systems or the support for doing so, and we recognize that this must change. CTUs need to be incentivized and not penalized for working broadly across networks, and that is an area of priority for us in the next couple of months. So to address these and other issues, NIAID is establishing 3 working groups to address discrete chunks of these issues. For each working group, we plan to assemble a working group of individuals who are knowledgeable, experienced, and appropriately vested in the particular issue or set of issues related and that we will address. These individuals will focus on those items and come up with solutions to these issues, which will be presented to NIAID for consideration. So between now and the issuance of the CTU awards in December of 2020, we will generate processes, we will pilot them, and tweak them in preparation for the new awards in 2020. So think of the PF activities as preparation for the next competitive cycle. Our plan is to come up with solutions now that we can pilot as soon as possible and tweak as necessary within this funding cycle, so that by the time we start off in the next funding cycle with the new awards in 2020, we will have a fairly well-defined and more efficient PF process. So the three working groups that we have come up with are as follows. The first one is the network working group. And this first group will comprise of representatives from each of the 5 current HIV and AIDS networks. Although we do not know how many networks we will end up with for the recompetition in the next funding cycle, we will have representatives from each of the 5 existing networks on these working groups. And their charge from this working group will be to come up with consistent strategies for determining the expenses captured in protocol visits, to develop consistent contractual language, and to develop consistent invoicing requirements and practices. So that's what that first working group will be dealing with. The second working group is the CTU CRS working group. And this will be comprised of individuals from CTUs and CRSs, specifically dealing with some of their activities as they currently exist, coming up with some best practices that they can present, and also looking at possibilities going into the next funding cycle. And the third working group will be the Pilot 2 working group. This working group is made up of representatives from each of the existing 5 networks, from some CTU staff, and as well as NIAID staff. Again, the goal here is to come up with something that we can use across all the networks, that we can pilot during this cycle and hopefully refine for use in the upcoming grant cycle. We want a consistent mechanism for costing so that it is clear to everyone how costs are determined. We want CTUs and CRSs to make decisions about which protocols and/or networks they will contribute to based on the scientific merit and capacity, and not based on which network or protocol appears to be the most lucrative from a funding perspective. So I'll just stop here, and I just want to thank you all for that have been engaged in the protocol funding process to date. Since we first proposed the PF pilot, we heard from many of you, and several of you have been very engaged. The results of your feedback have directly impacted the decisions we've made to date, and we expect that to continue going forward. We really appreciate your input. And now I'm going to see if there are any questions about the PF funding before I turn it back to Manizhe for some final thoughts.
I hope everyone found this session helpful. We very much look forward to continuing to dialogue with you as we move forward in the next 6 months. Please feel free to share with us any feedback you have with us on these areas of refinement or some of these specific areas related to collaboration and network affiliations. You can feel free to reach out to myself, Manizhe, or to Bola, or reach out through this website. And we'll look forward to seeing many of you in our focus group sessions over the next couple weeks. And we will be in touch about the Southeast US focus group, and we will follow up on what we have in terms of participation from Asia, from India and Southeast Asia for our South Africa focus groups, and see if we need to schedule another one. So I really want to thank everyone's participation, and everyone, we appreciate it, and we wish you a good day. Thank you.